Okay, good Friday morning, everyone, and welcome to the Backyard Naturalist. I am your host, Tim Vargo. I work at the Urban Ecology Center in the great city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we have a lot of backyards, and there's a lot of great things happening in those backyards. And so we gather here every week, every Friday at 9 a.m. to explore our backyards collectively together. And this week, we've got a doozy of a topic. Last week's topic was very specific, fat bears. This week's topic is about as general as it gets. We're talking about water. It's everywhere. We're made of it. We need it. We would die without it. And life as we know it everywhere would perish without it. It's that important. It enters our backyards through the sky in the form of rain or dew or fog. It enters our backyards through the ground, through decomposition. Sometimes it enters our backyards when all the bathrooms in our house are occupied and you don't have time to wait. We're talking about water in episode 7 of season 4 of the Backyard Naturalist. No rain, no gain. But first, a huge thank you to our Backyard Naturalist subscribers. We love you for your extra support in keeping this community going strong through season 4. These weekly get-togethers are free to the public, and subscribers help us keep it that way. I'd love for you to join the subscriber community with your own subscription, in part because it supports the program, but also because as a subscriber, you get access to our monthly in-person explorations of the backyards around the Milwaukee area in the form of our field trips. They are open to everyone, but are free to subscribers. And for November, we will visit one of the hidden gems in Milwaukee, the Cudahy Woods State Natural Area. It's tucked up right against the airport. And it's an outstanding example of the hardwood forest that once covered most of this area in Milwaukee County, with the exception of the Great Menominee Valley wetland prior to European settlement. There's 2 main sections in the woods, 2 excellent examples of, one is a dry mesic oak hickory forest in the northern part, and then there's a maple beech mesic forest to the south. More than 160 species of native plants, including some threatened and endangered ones. So if your imagination will let you, you can take a step back in time by about 200 years when you step into the Cudahy Woods. And if you're interested, you can contact me or go to the Urban Ecology Center website. The trip is Saturday, November 5th at 1:00 p.m. And while on the topic of trips, the UBC Eco Travel program will be leading a short 2-night trip to Indiana and Michigan to visit the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, which is just so strangely nestled between the scenic outpost of Gary, Indiana, and some really big power plants. So strange bedfellows, but really fascinating landscapes, and the birthplace really of ecology, the study of ecology and particularly ecological succession. And while on this trip, we will also take the opportunity to visit Jasper Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area in Indiana, which is in the heart of the once sprawling Kankakee Marsh, and a place where you can see between 10 and 20,000 sandhill cranes in one field. So really just an amazing spectacle, especially when they fly right over your head. We'll travel from Milwaukee by van, and so you won't have to worry about anything except how amazing the landscape and the wildlife is. If you're interested in this trip, contact me, or I'll be sending more information in our weekly Backyard Naturalist emails. And if you don't get those emails, let me know and I will rectify the situation. Or you can keep an eye on the UBC website for more information on these trips. A little bit closer to home in both space and time, tomorrow is the UBC's autumn celebration at Washington Park from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And this is one of my favorite UBC events, maybe a close second to Winterfest. But the autumn celebration has pumpkin carving, biking, canoeing, food, drink, great conversation. The fall colors really stand out in what might be my favorite Milwaukee green space. Sorry, other parks. So bring your family, your friends, it's free. You don't need to register, just come on by Washington Park tomorrow between 10 and 2 and soak in the fun. And if you've been regularly attending these Backyard Naturalist sessions or not, well, if you have been, you know we've been following some important NASA missions over the past couple of months. So as we often do, I'll just give a couple updates on 2 of the ones that we've really been following closely as we connect your backyards to space. And one of them is the Artemis 1 mission. So in our last update a couple weeks ago, this massive rocket, the most powerful rocket humans have ever built, had been rolled back to the vehicle assembly building to protect it from Hurricane Ian, and then also to do some minor repair work and to replace some batteries. So just a couple days ago, NASA announced that the rescheduled launch is for November 14th, so 1 month from today at midnight from the Kennedy Space Center. And interestingly, that puts it right on par with another launch at Cape Canaveral, which is a Japanese commercial lunar lander, the Hakuto R, designed by iSpace, a private company. And there's actually a whole slew of commercial and government lunar landers in development from several different companies and countries across the globe. So the moon is really the go-to destination for a lot of folks. But none of these missions are carrying humans. And at least for the Artemis mission, they hope to land humans on the moon with Artemis 3 in 2025. And then, so I thought with all these frustrating delays, it would be fun to watch this video. It's a NASA video designed to really generate hype and interest, but I wouldn't mind getting excited about this again. So here, let's watch it together.
Artemis stands ready. Ready to turn dreams into reality. Ready to return humanity to the moon and take us further than ever before. The culmination of inspiration and innovation, of Herculean efforts and steadfast collaboration, Artemis 1 is ready for departure. And the Artemis generation is about to leave its mark.
What will be a journey of more than 500,000 miles to the moon and back starts right here at Launch Complex 39 Bravo. Although this first flight will not carry a crew, it will test every system in the deep depths of space to prepare the way for future crewed missions.
When the final go is given and the teams at Kennedy Space Center release this rocket, Artemis will roar to life and we will witness the beginning of a tightly choreographed mission.
All engine run 2, 1, and lift off.
The first 2.5 minutes lift Artemis off Earth and build momentum. It's another 6 minutes of pressing uphill, accelerating to orbit. This is followed by a push from the second stage to raise Orion higher.
And once all the systems are cleared to continue, the second stage will fire again and push Orion beyond the bounds of Earth. At this point, we're going to the moon. It'll take several days to reach our destination, but as we sprint across the void, many new procedures and systems will be tested and proven.
240,000 miles later, Orion will enter an oval-shaped orbit around the moon, one that will take Orion to about 60 miles above the lunar surface and then out to 40,000 miles beyond the moon. This is a distance farther than any human-rated spacecraft has ever gone before.
As momentous as reaching the moon will be, returning to Earth is just as significant and challenging. Every observation we make, every lesson we learn on this journey prepares the way for humans to safely venture out and return home. And so on its final lap around the moon, Orion will ignite its main engine, push out of lunar orbit, and begin the long trek home.
This is a spacecraft built for the harsh conditions of deep space, as well as the intensity of returning home. Nearing Earth, Orion separates from the main power and propulsion systems of the European Service Module and prepares for the final sequence of events. Entering Earth's atmosphere at 24,500 miles per hour, the heat shield endures the fury of re-entry. The air around Orion reaches temperatures half as hot as the sun, but also slows Orion considerably. Until finally, Parachutes can deploy, allowing Orion to gently dip into the Pacific Ocean.
To the moon and safely home again. This is the journey of Artemis 1, and it will set the precedent for all that follows. United with partners around the world, this is the challenge we choose. To meet hand in hand, step by step, lighting the way from the Earth to the moon to Mars and beyond. We are ready.
So the video is titled Artemis 1, We Are Ready. Probably after all these setbacks, it should be Artemis 1, We're Almost Ready, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed that a month from now, on November 14th, we'll be celebrating a successful launch. It's really exciting to me. I mean, this is probably not as exciting as the first lunar mission, back in the day, but it's exciting for me, and it's huge, and really hoping it works. The other big NASA mission we've been following is one that is complete and extremely successful, the DART mission. So DART stands for Double Asteroid Redirection Test. And NASA took a refrigerator-sized spacecraft and smashed it into a small asteroid with the hope to see if they could divert in the future that there's an asteroid that was bound for Earth. So the mission was billed as humanity's first planetary defense test. Could we protect the Earth from something much more dire? And early results confirmed that the mission was a success. The collision and the force, the force caused by the ejecting debris, which is what you see in this picture on the right, and you can see the debris is kind of split into this bifurcated tail. It's got two parts. Those two forces together altered the orbit of the smaller asteroid Dimorphos around the larger asteroid Didymus. And in exactly the way they were hoping, they wanted to speed up the orbit of the smaller asteroid around the larger one. And they said if they could speed up that orbit by 10 minutes, so the orbit would go 10 minutes faster every revolution, they'd be excited. But they got it to speed up by 32 minutes, which was fantastic. I mean, it's fantastic enough that they were able to hit this pretty small object so many millions of miles away, but there's still a lot of work to do, and we'll still continue to observe this and learn from it. But it was an important step in realizing that it may be possible to prevent a catastrophic asteroid impact in the future. And then just quickly, the Orionid meteor shower reaches its peak next Thursday. If you're interested in getting outside, it's always best to get out after midnight, as your part of the Earth is rotating into the path of the incoming meteors. And it's called the Orionids because it originates from the constellation Orion. And it's also cool because what you're seeing with those meteors is the debris that's left by Halley's Comet. And that every 75 years it goes into orbit, or its orbit is 75 years. And we pass through the debris left by the tail of the comet as it approaches the sun. All right, so our topic of the week is water. This was really daunting, and by necessity, this is going to be part 1, and I'm really excited for part 2, maybe even part 3. I kind of scoured the available resources and found a really fun podcast that helped me lay out the framework today, called The Curious Cases of Rutherford and Fry, which has a water, 2-part water. So if you like podcasts, this is a great one to add to your library. I don't have a Latin name to post with water. We just know water is water, or H2O. Pretty simple, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. On the surface, this is very straightforward, very simple. Hydrogen and oxygen bonded together, 2 very common elements in the universe, 2 common atoms. And it's precisely this simplicity, and particularly there's a perceived simplicity, but when you look into it, water behaves very differently from just about any liquid on Earth. So you might think that if you're an engineer and you want to study liquids and how liquids behave, water would be the last place to start, just because it's a huge outlier. It behaves very differently from just about every other liquid. So it may be simple, but it's very complex and very strange. But what gives it its complexity is fairly simple. And so before we dive in to why water is so strange, we'll take a step back in time to the 5th century. So we have a human by the name of Thales, who was hanging out in a place called Miletus in Ionia, Asia Minor, which all those words today just means it's on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. He was a pretty important dude in Western science circles anyway, and Aristotle regarded him as the first philosopher in the Greek tradition. And like most philosophers at the time, he was a mathematician and an astronomer, as well as a statesman. And one thing that was pretty important to Thales was the quest to discover a natural cause for the origin of the universe, much like modern astrophysicists do. And what he was looking for was a term called the arch. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Aristotle defined the arch as that of which all existing things are composed, and that from which they originally come to be, and that into which they finally perish. So when Greeks talk about the origin, they're not talking about, something arising like the Big Bang. They're talking about matter that is eternal and has always existed, which actually is fairly similar in that regard. But Thales was questioning, what is the original element from which all other elements arose? And the 4 contenders at the time for that original element were the 4 basic elements. So you had earth, air, fire, and water. And the belief at the time was that these were the basic elements because while they could change into one another, they couldn't be broken down into anything smaller. So these were the basic components of the planet. And so Thales was on a quest to figure out which of these elements, though, was the original. There had to be original. And as the story goes, one day, Thales was walking along, just looking up at the stars, as astronomers often do, and he wasn't watching where he was going, and he fell into a well. And while likely thoroughly embarrassed, this is also thought to be the kind of iconic aha moment for Thales, kind of like the apple falling onto Newton's head. Sitting there soaked in water, the story goes, he determined that because water was ubiquitous, because it fell from the sky, it was in the soil, it was inside of plants and all other living things, the earth was thought to sit on water. And while he was sitting on water, he determined that water was the original element. And he believed that when you start with water, it can be changed into the other elements, earth, wind, and fire. So the story takes a bit of an ironic twist from here, because as one account of Thales' death had him dying from dehydration after watching a sporting event in the hot sun for several hours without drinking water. So the person that said everything was made of water ended up dying from lack of water. But for the next 1,000+ years, there was a little bit of argument among philosophers, but water was looked at as the fundamental stuff from which everything is made. And because it was an element, it was believed it could not be reduced or split into anything smaller. It was the quintessential stuff. But then fast forward about almost 1,500 years, now we're talking 1700s, a human by the name of Henry Cavendish enters the picture. He was an English philosopher who focused on chemistry and physics, best known for conducting the Cavendish experiment, which measured the density of the Earth, which then allowed the gravitational constant to be calculated. And Cavendish was also very interested in the element water. And it was well known at the time that if you took certain metals and inserted them into acids, liquids, you would get the formation of very small gas bubbles. And scientists also knew that those very small gas bubbles were flammable. But not truly understanding fire, the thought at the time was that anything that could catch on fire, anything that was flammable, contained an element called phlogistum. And if an element was very flammable, it was high in phlogistum. And if an element was not very flammable, it was probably had very little phlogistum in it. And if it didn't burn at all, it had no phlogistum. So the thought was that those bubbles that were caused by the acid were rich in phlogiston because they were flammable. And then Cavendish figured out that if you do this, if you burn those gases in a closed system, one of the things you produce is water. And so Cavendish concluded that the phlogiston in the gas combined with something in the air to produce water. And so this was groundbreaking for several reasons, but mainly now you're challenging the fact that water is the original element, that you can't, or even an element at all, because he was able to create it in an experiment. According to Cavendish's calculations then, the phlogiston in the gas, when burned in what he called dephlogisticated air, produced water. And then a few decades later, a French chemist by the name of Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier took this experiment one step further. He, by this time, had discounted this phlogiston theory, and according to Lavoisier, phlogiston did not exist, but he determined that what was burning in the experiment was a gas that he called hydrogen. And why did he call hydrogen? Because in that experiment, the gas bubbles, when burned in that closed system, produced water. So hydrogen means forming water, hydro for water. And that's how hydrogen got its name, because it would produce water when burned. And then he took the dephlogisticated air out of the equation and found that the gas that hydrogen was combining with, and he called it oxygen. So this guy got to name both of those things, hydrogen and oxygen. Pretty important person, and kind of his work stood the test of time as finding out that that's how you produce water. You combine hydrogen and oxygen. So the framework is laid for us to now look at the structure of water. You have two hydrogen atoms connected to one oxygen atom. Again, fairly simple, but it's not the structure. The structure is simple. The important part of this is that the bond both inside the molecule and between the molecules are different. So if you start within the molecule itself, you have hydrogen and oxygen, and they're held together by what's called a covalent bond. And what that means is that when hydrogen and oxygen combine, they share electrons. So they have different charges to begin with, they're attracted to each other, and then once they come together, they share these electrons. The key is that they're not super different. Their electronegativity is not very different. If it was much stronger, then the oxygen would just grab the hydrogen's electrons and keep it for themselves. So that would be too strong. So the difference is just enough that when they come together, they share the electron, as you can see in this picture. But the oxygen molecule is a little more greedy. And so it holds on to that electron a little bit tighter, which gives the oxygen a slightly negative charge. So if pretend you're the electron, and the oxygen molecule is your favorite coffee shop or pub, and the hydrogen molecule is, I don't know, your office or the classroom. So you'd probably rather spend more of your time over at the coffee shop and than the office. And so I don't know what that says about me, but with the electrons visiting the hydrogen side a bit less, the hydrogen part of water gets a positive charge, a slight positive charge. And then the oxygen side has a slight negative charge, because that's where the oxygen is, or the electrons are hanging out just a little bit more. The oxygen is kind of pulling those electrons towards it. So you have the two hydrogen ends that have a positive charge and the oxygen side that has a negative charge. And this is really important, because then when you go to the next step, that was one water molecule. But now the water molecules, if they're hanging out with other water molecules, you have the molecules attracted to each other, because the negative charge of the oxygen in one molecule is attracted to the positively charged hydrogen in another molecule. And this is what's called a hydrogen bond, and that's super important. It's strong, but it's not as strong as a covalent bond. It's strong, but not too strong. It's like the Goldilocks bond that's so important to life. So the water molecules are not bonded to each other, covalently sharing electrons, but they are bonded to each other because the attraction of the positively charged areas of one molecule to the negatively charged areas of the other molecule. And this causes a stability. It causes an energetically, it causes stability. This is the where water becomes stable. And just like we learned a while back that air pressure is constantly trying to stabilize, which is why we have wind, because you're trying to balance the areas of high and low pressure that are not stable. And so here we have a similar situation where electric charges in water are trying to stabilize into the lowest energy form. So negative areas are looking for positives and so on. And if there's a strong negative or a strong positive charge around, that's unstable. So the electrons in the molecule and the water molecules themselves are moving around trying to find the most stable structure, the least energy. So then this is the 2D representation. Then when you look at 3 dimensions now, the most stable formation of these water molecules hanging out with each other is this tetrahedral. It's a pyramid shape. And this is the most stable structure of water on its own. It's still extremely dynamic. The hydrogen bonds between molecules are constantly kind of stretching and relaxing. They're forming and breaking apart. They're not fixed together like when you take organic chemistry and you got those little Lego sets where you put water molecules together. It's not fixed like that. It's more like if each of those things was held together by bungee cords that could, form and reform. So it gives a stable flexibility that's super important. Not too stable, not too flexible. This is what water has that other liquids don't have. And this is what also gives water the really important life-giving properties that we rely on. So electrons are constantly bouncing around. The hydrogen bonds are flicking on and off between molecules. The podcast described it as like a strobe light flicking around everywhere that produces this dynamic stability. And then if you really want to take it to the extra layer, which I have a hard time doing, this is all, governed by quantum physics. So the electrons themselves have this quantum structure where they can be everywhere all at once, and there's probabilities. And if you try to detect them, they're big fans of Dr. Strange. There's a really recent article that's from the New York Times that's looking at now scientists, particularly the ones that won the Nobel Prize, are really making headway into marrying the Einstein theory of relativity with quantum physics. But so even with this fairly simple structure and you can leave it at that simple structure, you don't have to get into that other part. Just know that it's very dynamic. There's a lot going on with this stable flexibility. You have water that tries to form this kind of pyramid structure with other water molecules, but water also has a surface. And if we pretend that this group of molecules that we have here, let's now take it to the surface of the water. This causes a problem now because you can't have that molecule that was up on the top of the diagram because now that's replaced by air. So if you take away that molecule, now the molecule that it was attached to has higher energy. It lost its buddy that was keeping it stable. And now you have a buildup of an electric charge and it can't do anything about it. It's less stable and it's less happy. And actually you lose 2 of them, but for the sake of this argument, let's just pretend you lose that one. So now that one molecule can only bond with 2 other water molecules, but what it really wants to do is bond with 4. So you have to have areas like this because, water is not the only thing around. Water has to share the atmosphere with air. So that means there has to, even though water doesn't want it to be, you have to have a surface. But because of that dynamic flexibility, it still has some control over what it can do. It can't be at its ideal situation, but it will do everything it can to minimize that interface with the air. It wants to minimize the surface area because that makes it unstable. And then the geometric shape that minimizes the surface area is a sphere. And this is why we have raindrops. Water is coalescing into its most stable structure. This is why you can put 36 drops of water on a penny and it all sticks together. It's trying to make that, it's trying to minimize the surface area, and it causes this surface tension. because this is essentially surface tension is water trying to be in its most stable form, which is surrounded by other water molecules, and trying to minimize that surface area to water volume ratio. So water is gregarious, trying to hang out. They like that stability. And this might be one of the most important properties of water when you think of how it interacts with life. And that's something we'll go into a little bit more in part 2. But arguably, there's another property of water that might be its most important characteristic when it comes to life. And you may have heard that water is the universal solvent, because so many things can dissolve in its structure. And we know water likes to hang out with other water molecules, but it's not an exclusive party. So if water comes in contact with salt, and the salt's like, hey, water, what are you doing? Water's like, oh, we're just hanging out, but why don't you come hang out with us? But before you do that, you're going to need to kind of separate from your buddies if you want to join our party. So water still wants to have that stability, but because it's flexible, it can have that stability in other ways. So because water is charged, when salt breaks up into sodium and chloride ions, they are also charged. And so the positive charge in the hydrogen in water that was attracted to the oxygen in another water molecule will just as easily be attracted to the negative charge in chlorine, which is part of salt. And so they form their own little group. And then the negatively charged oxygen in the water can be attracted to the positively charged sodium ion, which is also part of salt. And then so everyone kind of finds this new electrically stable and happy place to hang out. So as long water's essentially saying, as long as you have a little bit of a charge, I'll happily hang out with you. This wouldn't be possible again if those water bonds were too strong. If that were the case, water would be, nope, you can't join our party. And then we wouldn't have salty oceans or Alka-Seltzer. And this also represents something called the amphoteric meaning of water. So water is amphoteric, which means it can be an acid and a base. And that's why salts can join water so readily. So even if you just have a glass of fresh water with nothing in it, there are naturally areas that are acidic because of that dynamic nature. So you have hydrogen ions maybe even breaking off, leaving behind a hydroxide base. So within that water, you're getting acid and base all the time. And electrons and ions are constantly moving around. And that's why it's such an excellent solvent, because it can absorb any acidic, almost any acidic or basic ions. But it's not universal. It does not dissolve everything, which is really important for us. So we know that water does not dissolve fatty and oily substances. So oil and water don't mix. Just look at your salad dressing. Because oil and water don't mix, or fatty substances and water don't mix, that's why we need detergents and soaps to break up the fatty foods in our dishes and pots. But that's really important, because if fats did dissolve in water, our cells have fatty lipid membranes. And so if water dissolved fats and oils, all of the cells in our bodies would essentially wouldn't be able to hold their shape. And then we would just become like a slimy, oozy mess because water would be dissolving everything, and then life would be very different. So it's a really good thing that water can dissolve a lot of things, but it's also very important that it doesn't dissolve everything, and particularly our cell walls. So water dissolves the salts and the nutrients that are vital to our existence. Substances are broken into ions. These ions are what allow information and electricity, neurons, all of that to pass. It allows that stuff to pass in and out of our cells and to keep our cells together. So our cell membranes are fatty. They don't dissolve. They can have a structure. They can have openings where ions and electric charges and information and molecules can flow in and out of cells. So our cell structure with that bilipid membrane becomes this perfect vessel that allows it to control water ions without dissolving itself. And this is probably the single most important property of water that's, again, different from most liquids, but super important to life on Earth, that it doesn't dissolve the things we don't want it to dissolve. So with that, there's still a lot of other properties of water that are really fun and really strange and really important, like why doesn't when water freezes, why doesn't the whole body of water freeze? So it has really strong ability to hold energy and to hold water. And then when you look at temperature and pressure changes and density, there's some really kind of strange ways why both salt and fresh water don't freeze from the bottom up, which would not be good for life. If you look at it at its simplest way, fresh water makes sense that it freezes at the top. Salt water, it doesn't. But when you look at the properties of water, it makes sense. But it shouldn't be that way because water is just a weird liquid. So this is, I've kind of reached the point where your brain gets a overcapacity trying to understand this stuff. But really, it's that flexible stability that's important to think about. It's that almost universal solvent that allows life. And then, so we'll take a quick trip from the brain kale to the brain candy, and I've got two just short and zen and fun videos to give our brain a rest. So we'll start with a video series that I haven't brought up in a while. It's one of my favorites, Don't Be Dumb. This has nothing to do with what we talked about today, but it has everything to do with water. So here we go.
Hello, thank you for joining me. I'm Josh Clark, and this is Don't Be Dumb. Have you ever heard that you need to drink 8-ounce glasses of water a day to stay healthy? Sure you have. This is not true. It's incorrect. In fact, no one's 100% certain where this dictum came from, and there's no evidence whatsoever that any healthy person needs 64 ounces or more of water a day to stay healthy. The closest anyone's ever guessed as to the origin of this 8 times 8 dictum is that back in the mid-19th century, the U.S. Food and Nutrition Board recommended that a person take in 1 milliliter of water per calorie eaten a day. On the low end, this roughly factors out to about 64 ounces of water a day. But the idea that you need to drink additional glasses of water, well, that's just hokum. See, we get water from all sorts of places, from our food, from our tea, our coffee, our sodas, and of course our water. Drinking 8 glasses of water on top of the water that we already normally take in on a daily basis is apparently totally superfluous. In fact, scientists think that the average healthy adult living in a temperate climate could probably survive without any additional water intake. You probably shouldn't try that, but the next time somebody tells you that you need to drink more water, you set them straight and tell them Josh sent you. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining me.
That's a fun little group of videos. And then this next Zen video is just people trying to do things because they can. All right, so with that moment of Zen, we'll end part 1 of the story of water. We'll ride this wave for a few weeks before we get into part 2, and maybe even part 3, who knows? But thank you for joining me today. I will stop sharing my screen. Look forward to seeing you next week.